CEO goes undercover as a janitor. What his employees did will shock you. Before we dive into this unbelievable story, tell us, have you ever had a terrible boss? Let us know in the comments. And if you love stories like this, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. David Carter had built an empire, but today he held a mop. He was a man who'd once sealed million-dollar deals from penthouse offices, yet here he was in a tattered uniform, pushing a bucket down the sterile hallway of his own company's regional branch. Within seconds, he sensed something was off. The receptionist in the lobby barely bothered to acknowledge him, her eyes flickering with annoyance when he politely asked for directions to the supply closet. He thanked her anyway, but she didn't respond, turning instead to her phone as if he didn't exist. David felt a surprising jolt in his chest. Employees who worked under him, under his leadership, were supposed to treat everyone with basic respect, but apparently, janitors were beneath notice here. He swallowed that first sting of humiliation, telling himself it was all part of the plan. He needed the truth. He'd suspected for months that the culture had shifted in some of the branches, that corners were being cut, and morale was plummeting. Now, disguised in cheap shoes and a worn-out baseball cap, he was about to see just how deep the rot went. His heart pounded harder than it ever had in any board meeting, and in just the first few minutes, he knew his worst fears were coming true. 2 employees scurried by, talking in hushed tones, eyes darting nervously as if expecting to be overheard by the wrong person. One of them dropped a file folder, scattering papers across the hallway. The other whispered something about watching out for Bryce. David bent to help gather the papers, but before he could even lift a single sheet, the second employee snatched them away without a word of thanks. They both shot him a quick, uneasy glance and rushed off. Bryce? The name didn't ring a bell immediately, but David suspected it belonged to someone in management. Tucking away that piece of information, David pressed on, determined to learn more. He found the supply closet eventually, a cramped space smelling of bleach and damp cardboard. He grabbed a mop and the appropriate cleaning solutions, then trudged to the main lobby to start his first task. The floors were pristine to begin with, which made him wonder if cleaning was just a charade in this place. Maybe the real filth here couldn't be scrubbed away with soap and water. As he wrung the mop, he spotted an older man in a crisp suit towering over a younger woman at the front desk. The woman was barely more than a girl. Her ID badge read Sophie, and she looked like she wanted to sink into the floor. David couldn't make out every word, but the man's tone was menacing. Something about her taking too long on a break, how her time would be docked if she didn't learn to be grateful for the job. Sophie apologized, voice trembling. Then the man turned his head slightly, caught sight of David, and dismissed him with a single derisive sniff. The tension in the air was so thick David could taste it. He didn't want to blow his cover, so he tried to look busy, cleaning a corner of the floor that was already spotless. He looked up, just in time, to see Sophie slinking away, shoulders slumped, her face etched with silent defeat. David's hands clenched around the mop's handle. He could feel his temper flaring. This was not how any human being, let alone one of his employees, should be treated. But he forced himself to breathe, to maintain the disguise. If he wanted genuine insight into what was happening, he'd have to play the part to perfection. Silent, obedient, practically invisible. Just as David finished wiping down that unnecessarily clean patch of floor, the older man stormed off, muttering something under his breath about lazy staff. The receptionist behind the desk rolled her eyes at him, then actually scowled at David, almost as if to say, "Don't you try anything funny either." So this wasn't just a one-off outburst or the ranting of a cranky supervisor. There was a pattern here, a pattern of disrespect, intimidation, and disregard. David swallowed hard, reminding himself that his mission had only begun. He took one more look at the departing figure's badge, Bryce Walker, regional manager, and realized this was the man the employees had muttered about in the hallway. This was the man who'd likely set the toxic tone in this branch. And from the looks of things, everyone was under his oppressive thumb. David decided to head down the corridor and start cleaning around the cubicles, thinking he'd get a closer look at how people interacted away from the main lobby. As he walked, a wave of quiet tension followed him. Heads ducked, voices hushed, as though nobody wanted to draw attention to themselves. Yet David could hear the faint echoes of complaints. About pay, about impossible deadlines, about supervisors who turned a blind eye to harassment. The more he listened, the more his stomach churned. For months, rumors had circulated at the corporate headquarters about certain branches with high turnover or productivity issues. David had tried sending out memos, encouraging a more supportive culture, but words on paper clearly hadn't been enough. Now that he was seeing it with his own eyes, he understood that a more drastic intervention was needed. He just hadn't realized how dire things had become. When he reached the cluster of cubicles near the back, he saw Sophie again. She was typing away, glancing anxiously at the clock. Next to her was another young employee, Ethan, who looked too nervous to even breathe properly. David pretended to mop around their desks, hoping to catch snippets of their conversation. "I can't get fired," Ethan whispered desperately. "I'm behind on rent. If Bryce cuts my hours or—" Sophie gave him a sympathetic look. "I know. He's been on edge all day, ever since that big corporate memo came through. Something about them sending an inspector." She grimaced. "If it's someone like him in a higher position, God help us." David's heart twisted. Here they were, living in fear of a corporate inspector, never guessing he was right there with them. Not to punish them, but to save them. He wanted to assure them that everything would be okay, but he couldn't. Instead, he cast them a gentle glance as he passed. Sophie offered him a small tentative smile in return, one that suggested she might appreciate even a crumb of kindness in this hostile environment. As David continued down the row, he nearly bumped into Bryce again, standing, their arms folded, surveying the floor like he was a king guarding his castle. Bryce's eyes flickered over David's janitor uniform before he moved on, shouting at a timid intern who'd apparently made a mistake on some data entry. The intern looked like he might burst into tears at any second, but Bryce just went on, scolding, voice dripping with contempt. David's pulse hammered in his temples. He knew he had to endure this masquerade a bit longer, but with every passing minute, his anger burned hotter. Still, he kept his cool, telling himself that he needed solid proof, clear examples of wrongdoing. Only then could he confront Bryce and ensure that real changes were made. Already, he had more than enough to justify a serious crackdown. But a part of him wanted to witness the full scope of the problem, not just a glimpse. If Bryce was this awful in public, David dreaded to think how he might act behind closed doors. And so the undercover CEO silently pledged to keep a watchful eye and gather the evidence he needed. One thing was certain: if Bryce Walker thought he could continue to bully and harass under the radar, he had no idea just who he was dealing with and how his entire world was about to collapse. David's day had only begun, but he could already feel the tension in every corner of this office space. He'd never expected that the company he'd spent years building could produce such a poisonous offshoot. Anger simmered inside him, mingling with disappointment. But another emotion was stirring too: determination. Determination to fix this, to set things right for Sophie, for Ethan, and for every employee who'd been living in fear under Bryce's iron fist. David had only stepped onto the stage, and the drama had already reached a boiling point. Little did Bryce or the rest of them know, the real show was just beginning. David continued to push his mop down the corridor, passing the break room, on his right. He heard raised voices inside and paused just outside the open door. Two employees were arguing quietly, though their hushed tones didn't diminish the tension in the air. One was a middle-aged man in a wrinkled dress shirt, the other a younger woman with a clipboard, clutched protectively against her chest. The man snapped, "We can't afford another sick day. Didn't you hear about what happened to Andrew when he took a day off without Bryce's approval?" The woman frowned, her eyes darting around as though someone might be listening. I know. But if she's really sick, she shouldn't be here. She could spread it to everyone else." The man lowered his voice even further, growling, "Look, you do what you want, but if Bryce finds out you let someone off without his okay, you're finished." The words made David's stomach churn. This branch wasn't just toxic, it was borderline inhumane. People were scared to take sick days, worried about repercussions from a tyrant manager. He almost dropped his act right then and there to storm in, identify himself as CEO, and put a stop to it all. But his gut told him to wait. He needed to see how deep the rabbit hole went. So he moved on, resisting the urge to confront them. His phone vibrated in his pocket, a silent notification he'd set for corporate updates. He imagined his executive assistant emailing him, oblivious to the fact that he was currently mopping floors in one of his own facilities. Part of him felt a pang of guilt for not looping in more people on this undercover operation, but he knew that if word got out, the entire plan would be blown. Sometimes, to get the unfiltered truth, you had to walk among your employees like a ghost, invisible, yet all-seeing. Another half-hour of cleaning passed, during which David witnessed a series of small yet telling incidents that painted a grim picture. An older employee asked for an extended lunch break to pick up medication, only to be rebuffed by a supervisor, quoting some archaic policy. A junior accountant timidly approached an HR representative, only to be brushed off because the boss doesn't like whiners. The pattern was consistent. Everyone, from top to bottom in this branch, was either contributing to or living in fear of the toxic status quo. And looming over it all was Bryce Walker, the manager who seemed to take pleasure in keeping everyone under his thumb. Around midday, the employees started to migrate to the break room for lunch. David, blending in as best he could, followed. Suit with his lunch bag, he'd packed a simple sandwich to keep up appearances. He took a seat at a small battered table in the corner, away from the main clusters of employees. He didn't want to be too conspicuous, but he did want to overhear conversations, and overhear he did. Two women at a nearby table whispered about how the last person who tried to report Bryce to the regional HR hotline was let go within a week for performance issues. Another pair speculated that Bryce might have connections higher up, given that no one seemed able to touch him. David mentally noted every detail, every rumor, every fear. He couldn't let Bryce get away with this, and he wouldn't. Just as he was finishing his sandwich, he noticed Sophie slip into the break room, her lunch still unopened. She looked drained, dark circles under her eyes. She found a seat at an empty table, placing her lunch in front of her but not opening it. Her posture screamed defeat. David wondered if he should approach her, maybe muster some comforting words. But before he could decide, Bryce entered, scanning the room with a hawk-like gaze. The entire room fell silent, as if someone had pressed the mute button on a TV remote. Bryce's eyes landed on Sophie, and David saw a flicker of something like sadistic glee in his expression. "You, Sophie," Bryce said, barely loud enough to be heard by everyone. "Stop lazing around. I need those quarterly numbers updated. By 1 o'clock. Sophie glanced at the clock on the wall. It was already 12:30. Her shoulders sagged. She opened her mouth to protest, but Bryce shot her a look that would freeze boiling water. Without another word, Sophie gathered her uneaten lunch and headed out, eyes downcast. The hush in the room deepened, employees exchanging looks of pity but doing nothing else. David clenched his fists under the table. He'd seen enough. In a normal, healthy work environment, managers might be firm, but they certainly wouldn't degrade people this way. He reminded himself, though, that he was here to see the worst of it, to gather every piece of evidence. He pressed his lips together and forced himself to remain in his seat, even though every fiber of his being wanted to stand up and say, "That's enough!" Still, he stayed in character, a lowly janitor, powerless and voiceless. But inside, he was fuming. If Bryce thought he was untouchable, the man was in for a rude awakening. As lunch break ended, people scuttled back to their desks, their hushed murmurs replaced by the mechanical hum of an office that felt more like a factory line. David took the opportunity to empty trash bins around the office, a task that put him into close proximity with a lot of desks and gave him the chance to witness the daily struggles of these employees firsthand. He saw how they jumped at the sound of footsteps, how they minimized their screens the second a shadow passed over their cubicles. Bryce roamed the aisles like a warden patrolling a prison, randomly stopping to question what someone was doing, how long it was taking, and why they weren't working faster. Each time David felt his blood boil a bit more. It was only mid-afternoon, and already David felt as though he'd spent a week in this hostile environment. The hours stretched on, the tension mounted, and the lines between typical office stress and outright toxic culture became clearer with every minute. David knew the time for revealing himself would come soon, but not yet, because something told him the worst was still to come, and he needed to be there, mop in hand, to bear witness. When it did, he steeled himself, vowing not to leave until he had all the proof he needed to expose Bryce for what he was. And little did anyone else in that office realize by the day's end, nothing would ever be the same again. In the late afternoon, David was diligently wiping down the windows near the conference rooms, hoping his reflection in the glass wouldn't give away the expensive haircut he'd gotten just a few days earlier. He caught a glimpse of his own eyes, noticing the anger brewing there, but he forced himself to look calm. A group of employees filed into the largest conference room, heads bowed, led by none other than Bryce Walker himself. David guessed it was some kind of team meeting. He quickly finished cleaning the window and moved closer to the door, pretending to mop. The door was slightly ajar, and he could hear Bryce's voice booming inside. "You all need to step it up," Bryce declared. "Corporate's been breathing down my neck about numbers, deadlines, productivity, you name it. If we don't hit our targets, heads will roll." A brief pause. "And trust me, it won't be mine." David heard a murmur of agreement from the room, though it sounded more like fearful compliance than real support. Someone tried to ask a question, but Bryce cut them off. "No excuses. I don't care if your personal life is in shambles. I don't care if you're sick or your computer crashes. Get the job done or I'll find someone else who can." David heard chairs squeaking, as if people were shifting uncomfortably, but no one dared speak up. The meeting ended abruptly, with Bryce storming out of the room, practically colliding with David in the hallway. Bryce narrowed his eyes at David, who managed to give a small nod of deference. "Clean the conference room," Bryce barked. "It's a mess." Then he stomped off before David could even respond. David peered inside the conference room to see a dozen employees still seated, looking drained. Their gazes flicked to him, and a few hurriedly got up to leave. But Sophie lingered, her notebook clutched to her chest. She was breathing unevenly as though holding back tears. David paused near the door, making eye contact with her, silently asking if she was okay. She gave a slight shrug, lips trembling. Then she gathered her things and exited. David quietly shut the door behind her, scanning the room. Papers were scattered everywhere, coffee cups lay abandoned, and the atmosphere felt like a funeral parlor. He methodically picked up the trash, but his thoughts were racing. Bryce's tyranny was worse than he'd imagined. Employees weren't just demoralized, they were practically paralyzed by fear. He wondered if people like Sophie and Ethan would ever find the courage to push back, or if they'd simply wither under Bryce's oppressive rule day after day. As he tossed crumpled papers into a bin, he noticed something scribbled on a sheet. "Meeting with HR, don't bother. Bryce always finds out." David's heart sank. Even the official channels for reporting workplace abuse were compromised. If Bryce truly had connections, then the employee's predicament was more dire than he thought. He sighed, placed the paper in the trash, and reminded himself that he couldn't blow his cover just yet. He needed to let this situation escalate, let Bryce reveal the full extent of his cruelty, so that when the hammer finally dropped, it would come down with undeniable force. He left the conference room and made his way down the corridor again. On his route, he spotted a flicker of movement near one of the private offices. A younger employee, Lisa, was trying to open a locked door. She looked frustrated, typing in a code multiple times to no avail. Finally, she swore under her breath and turned, nearly bumping into David. "Oh, sorry," she said, cheeks flushing. "I'm locked out of my own office space. Bryce changed the security code without telling me." She forced a laugh, though her eyes were red. David, maintaining his role, just nodded sympathetically. Lisa bit her lip. "You're new here, right? Janitor? I haven't seen you before." David nodded again, trying not to speak too much. "Well," she continued, "just keep your head down. This place isn't exactly friendly these days." Then she walked off, eyes downcast. David felt a pang of guilt for deceiving her. He wished he could say, "I'm not just a janitor, I'm the CEO and I'm here to fix this mess." But that moment hadn't come yet. Instead, he resumed his routine, cleaning one area after another, witnessing the same pattern of fear, frustration, and suffocating tension. Eventually, the clock ticked closer to 5 and some employees started leaving, grateful to escape even for a night. Others braced themselves for overtime, whether voluntary or coerced. David was about to head back to the lobby when he heard raised voices from an office near the back. His instincts told him to investigate. He found Bryce cornering Ethan, the young employee who'd been so anxious earlier. Ethan was trembling, his eyes wide with alarm. "You made a mistake on these forms, kid," Bryce snarled, waving a stack of papers in Ethan's face. "I don't have time to babysit you. Fix it now or consider yourself unemployed." Ethan tried to sputter an apology, explaining that the software had glitched. Bryce scoffed. "Excuses. I don't pay you to blame the computer." A wave of righteous anger surged through David. He took a step forward, intending to intervene, but then pulled back. Bryce might not have recognized him from earlier, but he definitely saw him as the janitor. If David stepped in now, would Bryce become suspicious? Or would he simply blow up at him too? Could David risk revealing himself prematurely? He hesitated, letting the scene play out for a moment longer. Bryce threw the papers at Ethan's feet, the sheets scattering across the floor. "Pick them up, you pathetic excuse for an employee," he growled. Ethan bent down, blinking back tears, as Bryce stood over him, arms folded. David's jaw clenched. This had gone on long enough. He might not blow his cover entirely, but he couldn't just watch this cruelty continue. So he cleared his throat, loudly, hoping to at least break the tension. Bryce turned, his eyes narrowing. "What do you want?" he snapped at David. "Did you come to see how incompetent this clown is?" David forced a deferential tone. "I was just cleaning around. Here, saw some mess on the floor." Bryce sneered. "Fine, mop it up then. And while you're at it, remind this idiot how to do his job." Then he stormed off, leaving Ethan kneeling amid the scattered papers. David crouched down, helping Ethan gather the papers. "Hey," David murmured quietly, "it's gonna be okay." Ethan sniffled, trying to compose himself. He glanced at David, eyes filled with gratitude and confusion. "Thanks," he mumbled. "You don't have to help me, you know." David just nodded, his emotions swirling. He wished he could do more, say more. But for now, this small act of kindness was all he could offer. Together they picked up the papers, and David felt his resolve harden. He was done passively observing. The next time Bryce humiliated someone like this, David would show him that not everyone in this office was willing to be bullied into silence. Ethan eventually hurried back to his desk, leaving David alone in the hallway. The place was nearly empty now, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. David found himself staring at the reflection of his own face in a glass partition, fists clenched. He told himself that tomorrow was another day, another chance to expose the true depths of Bryce's cruelty, and he vowed silently, "This ends soon," because as the man who founded this company, David Carter wasn't going to stand by while one of his branches rotted from the inside out. Bryce might rule this office with an iron fist, but his reign of terror was about to be shattered by the very janitor he thought was beneath him. When the next day dawned, David arrived extra early, hoping to catch the employees in those first quiet moments before the daily storm of Bryce's intimidation began. He wanted to see how they behaved when Bryce wasn't hovering over them. But to his surprise, Bryce was already there. The manager stood in the lobby, clipboard in hand, barking orders at the receptionist. It wasn't even 8 a.m., yet Bryce was in full form, criticizing, complaining, and micromanaging. As David walked past, Bryce shot him a contemptuous look, and then continued ranting at the receptionist about tardy employees. David had to fight the urge to roll his eyes. He headed to the break room, hoping to see if Sophie or Ethan were there. Indeed, he found Sophie, sipping coffee with trembling hands. She looked like she hadn't slept all night. David approached carefully, trying not to startle her. She glanced up and managed a half-smile. "You're the janitor, right?" she asked softly. David nodded. "Saw you around yesterday." She bit her lip. I just want to say thanks for not laughing when Bryce was on my case." David wasn't sure how to respond. He shrugged, attempting to stay in character. Sophie eyed the door, then leaned closer, lowering her voice. "I don't know what to do. I need this job to pay off my student loans, but Bryce is making my life a living hell." Her voice trembled. I've tried talking to HR, but they said it's not their jurisdiction, that everything has to go through Bryce first. She scoffed. What a joke, right? Like going through him will fix anything. David's heart clenched. He wished he could tell her the truth, that real help was on the way, but he couldn't risk blowing his cover yet. Instead, he just nodded sympathetically. Sophie sighed. Anyway, thanks for listening. Be careful, okay? Bryce doesn't like people who stand out. She gave him a meaningful look before leaving to start her shift. David remained, staring at the dingy linoleum floor, grappling with his frustration. If corporate policy was being twisted so that HR effectively served Bryce's interests, the problem was bigger than he thought, and that meant his intervention would need to be even more decisive. Not long after, the day truly got underway. Employees trickled in, shoulders hunched, eyes weary. David picked up his mop and bucket, beginning the day's routine, but his mind was elsewhere, formulating a plan. He didn't just want to confront Bryce. He wanted to make sure that once Bryce was gone, the culture could heal. That required a clear demonstration to everyone that power could shift in an instant, that no tyrant was truly unassailable. David told himself he needed the perfect moment, a moment where Bryce's abuse was so blatant, so undeniable, that revealing his identity would strike like lightning. Mid-morning, David was cleaning a row of cubicles when he overheard a hushed conversation. Lucas, an older employee with a cautious expression, was talking to Lisa, the woman who'd been locked out of her office. "We have to do something," Lisa whispered urgently. "This can't go on. People are quitting left and right." Lucas shook his head, a flicker of despair in his eyes. "And go where? Every time someone leaves, Bryce blacklists them. I heard he calls up other companies and trashes their references." Lisa looked stricken. "So we're stuck?" Lucas exhaled, nodding grimly. David pretended to scrub a stubborn stain on the floor, but his ears were tuned in to every word. Blacklisting former employees was not only unethical, it was potentially illegal. This was more fuel for the fire, more reason why Bryce had to be stopped. David made a silent vow to track down those who'd left, to see if there was evidence of Bryce's sabotage. But for now he just kept mopping, blending into the background. A couple hours later, the hush of the office was broken by Bryce's voice booming from the far end. David craned his neck to see what was happening. Bryce stood at Sophie's desk, slamming a folder onto it with such force that Sophie visibly flinched. "This is unacceptable," Bryce snarled, pointing at some document. "You're supposed to have these reports finalized by noon." Sophie's cheeks flushed. "I'm still working on them, sir. The system crashed and—" Bryce cut her off with a snarl. "I don't want excuses. You think corporate wants to hear your sob story?" He leaned in, voice dropping to a menacing hiss. "I can replace you in a heartbeat. Don't think I won't." David felt his blood pressure spike. He wanted to intervene, but he also sensed that this might not be the moment. Instead, he watched as Bryce stomped away, leaving Sophie on the brink of tears. Several employees stared in horror, but none dared to speak up. David noticed Ethan step forward, looking like he wanted to offer Sophie some comfort, but at the last second he backed away. Fear had them all paralyzed. When lunchtime rolled around, David found himself back in the break room. He saw Ethan anxiously picking at a cold sandwich, his appetite clearly gone. David sat at the same table, putting on the appearance of a tired janitor taking a rest. Eventually, Ethan mustered the courage to speak. "I can't do this anymore," he confessed, voice quivering. "I've never been treated like this. I used to be excited about this job. Now I dread coming in every day." He dropped his gaze to his half-eaten sandwich. David listened silently, wishing he could reveal who he was. Ethan continued, "But I can't afford to quit. My savings are almost gone." Then he let out a shaky sigh and glanced at David. "Maybe you don't care. You're probably just here to earn a paycheck, but still you seem nicer than the others." David's heart went out to him. He wanted to say something comforting, but all he could manage was a reassuring nod. Inside, though, he was boiling with anger. Anger at a system that trapped people like Ethan, Sophie, and Lisa in a cycle of fear and dependence. Bryce strutted into the break room, eyes scanning for potential targets. Catching sight of David, And Ethan, he walked over, sneering. "Look at this," he said loudly. "A pair of slackers having a chat instead of working." Ethan's cheeks went crimson, and David held himself in check. "Break time," Ethan mumbled defensively. "Bryce," scoffed. "Get back to your desk, boy, before I decide your break is over." Ethan shot up, hurriedly gathering his things. Bryce then turned his gaze to David. "And you, mop the floors. They're disgusting." The floors were actually clean, but David just nodded, reminding himself to keep his cool. The day was wearing on and tensions were hitting new peaks. David sensed that a breaking point was near, and he suspected it would come sooner rather than later. As he followed Bryce out of the break room, David saw Sophie dart into the restroom, looking as though she might burst into tears at any second. Lisa passed by, giving David a worried glance. "We're losing her," Lisa whispered, voice heavy with concern. David could only nod in acknowledgement. He'd seen how fragile Sophie was after constant berating, and it broke his heart that she felt so powerless, but the time for illusions would end soon. Bryce was pushing everyone to their limits, and David knew that once the tipping point arrived, there'd be no turning back. He replayed his plan in his head. Gather irrefutable evidence, let Bryce incriminate himself through repeated outbursts, then reveal his identity in a moment so public, so undeniable, that Bryce's reign would collapse under its own weight. It was risky, but it was the only way to ensure lasting change. And if there was one thing David had learned in his years of building a business, it was that sometimes you had to take big risks to achieve a meaningful reward. He resumed his janitorial tasks, though his mind was locked on the bigger picture. The office was a powder keg, with Bryce's every sneer lighting another fuse. David sensed that an explosion was inevitable, and all he had to do was make sure he was there when it happened, so he could direct the fallout in a way that protected the innocent and exposed the guilty. Because if Bryce thought he could keep humiliating, threatening, and firing employees without consequence, he was sorely mistaken. The disguised CEO's patience was running out, and the moment he unleashed the truth, Bryce Walker's smug world would crumble around him. Late that same afternoon, as the clock neared closing time, a sudden commotion erupted near the front desk. David, who had been mopping in a distant hallway, rushed over to see what was happening. The tension in the air felt like a coiled spring about to snap. When he arrived, he found Sophie backed against the reception counter, eyes wide and frightened. Bryce towered over her, face contorted in rage. His voice thundered through the lobby, echoing off the walls for everyone to hear. "I've had enough of your excuses," Bryce snarled, jabbing a finger at Sophie's face. "You missed another deadline. Do you think I'm running a charity here? You either perform or you're out." Sophie trembled, tears glazing her eyes. Her voice shook as she tried to explain. My software crashed again. I lost half the data and had to re-enter everything." Bryce slammed his hand on the counter, making Sophie flinch. "Don't you dare talk back to me, you little incompetent." He spat out another insult that made several bystanders gasp. David felt his pulse hammer. This was no longer just about poor leadership. It was outright verbal abuse, and it was happening right in front of half the staff who were gathering to leave for the day. A few employees hovered nearby, exchanging horrified glances. Ethan stood among them, hands clenched into fists. Lisa and Lucas looked torn, as if they wanted to intervene but were paralyzed by fear. David knew the moment was at hand, but still he held himself back, hoping that maybe one of the employees would find the courage to speak up first. Sophie, fighting back tears, tried to muster a response. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'll stay late and finish." Bryce snorted. "Oh, you'll stay late, all right. And if it's not done by tomorrow morning, don't bother coming back." He paused, then added in a sneering tone, "People like you are a dime a dozen." Something in the atmosphere cracked. Sophie's lip quivered, but instead of cowering, she drew a shaky breath. I've done my best," she stammered, desperation mingling with a glimmer of defiance. Bryce laughed harshly. Your best? Your best isn't good enough for me or this company." That was it. Sophie looked around at her co-workers, tears rolling down her cheeks. "Does nobody see how unfair this is? How cruel?" Her voice wobbled, but there was a spark in her eyes. A hush fell over the lobby. Some employees lowered their gazes, guilt flickering in their expressions. Bryce took a step closer, looming over her. "Get out of my sight," he hissed, "before I really lose my temper." Sophie hesitated for a moment, then gathered her things and fled, brushing past David with tears streaming down her face. Bryce spun around to face the small crowd of onlookers. "Anyone else want to question my authority?" he asked, voice dripping with venom. The employees averted their eyes, trying to make themselves invisible. David gripped the mop handle, so tightly his knuckles turned white. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to step forward. Yet he still waited just a moment longer, because he sensed the confrontation was about to ramp up even further. And ramp up it did. Bryce spotted Ethan standing there, a mixture of horror and anger on his face. "You got something to say?" "Boy," Bryce barked. Ethan swallowed hard. His eyes flickered to Sophie's departing figure, then back to Bryce. For a split second, David thought Ethan might speak up, but fear won out. Ethan shook his head, lowering his gaze. Bryce let out a derisive chuckle. "That's what I thought." He waved a dismissive hand at the group. "All of you, get back to work or get out. I don't pay you to stand around gawking." The crowd dispersed in a flurry of quick steps and tense shoulders, leaving Bryce standing there like a victorious predator. David's blood boiled. He could hardly contain himself, but he reminded himself the time for a full reveal would come soon, and it would be on his terms. For now he had what he needed, a public display of Bryce's cruelty that everyone had witnessed. He left the lobby quietly, making sure Bryce didn't see the fury in his eyes. He walked down a side corridor, rounding a corner until he was alone. Then he stopped, leaned against the wall and let out a trembling breath. The emotional toll of watching his own employees be humiliated was almost too much to bear. But if the plan was to work, he had to wait just a little longer. He clenched his fists, heart pounding. Soon, he told himself. Soon Bryce would face the consequences of his actions. Later that evening, after most employees had gone home, David continued his janitorial tasks. He knew Sophie was still somewhere in the building, trying to finish the reports Bryce demanded. Sure enough, he found her at her desk, tears dried. On her cheeks, typing furiously. She looked exhausted, like she was running on fumes. David approached quietly, placing a hand on the edge of her cubicle to announce his presence. Sophie glanced up, eyes red. "Oh, it's you," she said softly. "Don't worry, I'm not leaving yet. I know what he said." David offered a gentle nod, though he longed to say something more. He couldn't, not yet, but this was too much to witness silently, so he gently murmured, "You're not alone." Sophie blinked, new tears threatening to spill. She seemed too drained to question how this janitor could be so empathetic. Instead, she just whispered, "Thank you." As David turned to leave, she called after him, "I just hope, maybe, someone can stand up to him someday." David paused, back turned to her, and let the silence hang. He couldn't give her a direct answer, but he hoped his presence, his quiet support, might provide a small glimmer of hope. Tomorrow, he told himself, or the day after. Bryce's downfall was imminent, and Sophie wouldn't have to suffer in silence for much longer. He left her there, the clacking of her keyboard echoing in the nearly empty office. Outside, the city lights twinkled. David felt both sorrow and resolve swirling in his chest. It was heart-wrenching to see such good people pushed to the brink by one man's cruelty. But he also felt empowered by the knowledge that he could and would end it. Every minute he spent in this janitor's uniform only made him more certain of his path. Bryce had shown his true colors time and again, and now David was convinced that the only way to uproot this toxicity was a public confrontation so explosive that no one could question its outcome. Before he left for the night, David peeked into Bryce's office. The door was locked, the lights out. He wondered if Bryce had gone home smug and satisfied, believing he'd maintained his iron grip on the staff. A slow anger churned in David's gut. Let Bryce have his false sense of security. In just a matter of days, maybe even hours, Bryce would find out that real power doesn't come from bullying or intimidation, but from genuine respect and leadership. And in this case, that real power was about to come in the form of a revelation that would leave Bryce utterly humiliated. The stage was set for the final act, and David was ready for the curtain to rise. The next morning arrived with a nervous buzz in the air. Whispers circulated about how Sophie had stayed until midnight, finishing those reports Bryce demanded. People were anxiously speculating whether she'd be fired anyway, because Bryce's anger often defied logic. David, disguised once again, in his janitorial attire, began his shift by wiping down the glass doors at the entrance. The moment he stepped inside, he sensed the tension was worse than ever. Employees were hushed, eyes darting to and fro, like animals bracing for an approaching predator. Sure enough, Bryce appeared in the lobby at around 8:30, wearing a self-satisfied smirk. In his hand he held a folder, probably Sophie's reports. David paused, cloth in hand, pretending to polish the glass while he watched the unfolding drama. Bryce marched straight to Sophie's desk, dropped the folder with a thud and snarled, "Barely passable." Sophie closed her eyes, inhaling sharply. "I did the best I could," she murmured. Bryce shrugged. "Doesn't mean it's good." "Enough! Watch yourself or you'll be next on the chopping block." Sophie clenched her fists but said nothing. The entire office seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if Bryce would escalate further. Instead, he strutted away, calling out orders to various employees. David could practically see the man's ego swelling with each passing minute. But David also noticed a ripple of dissent in the employees' expressions. People like Lisa, Lucas and Ethan looked on with thinly veiled contempt. They were done with Bryce's cruelty, but too scared to confront him directly. That was exactly the moment David had been waiting for, the collective frustration nearing a boiling point. Just waiting for a spark. He had a feeling that spark would come sooner than later, especially given Bryce's short fuse. The day dragged on, each hour marked by a fresh wave of bullying. Bryce berated the receptionist for not answering calls fast enough. He threatened a junior accountant with termination for a minor typo. He sneered at David the janitor more than once, telling him to stop loitering and get back to work. Each jab fueled David's resolve. By lunchtime, David noticed that several employees had huddled together in a corner of the break room. He lingered just outside the door, mopping aimlessly, to overhear their whispers. Lucas's voice, "We can't keep living like this. It's not worth it." Lisa's reply, "But what can we do? HR is useless. Corporate seems indifferent. We need something drastic." A third voice chimed in, "Even if we all stand together, Bryce can fire us all, then where would we be?" David's heart panged with empathy, but he also knew their concern was valid. Still, a sense of camaraderie was growing among them, the beginnings of a collective stance against tyranny. Then the breaking point arrived. Early in the afternoon, Bryce called an impromptu staff meeting in the open area by the cubicles. He claimed it was to address performance concerns. Everyone gathered, forming a loose circle, tension thick in the air. David positioned himself at the periphery, clutching his mop handle, eyes trained on Bryce's every move. Bryce launched into a tirade about how the branch's performance metrics were unacceptable, how he was getting heat from corporate, and how heads would roll if things didn't improve immediately. He singled out employees by name, publicly shaming them for what he considered their shortcomings. When he reached Sophie, she tried to protest that she'd worked late to finish the reports, but Bryce cut her off. "That's the bare minimum. Sweetheart," he sneered, "so don't pat yourself on the back." Suddenly Ethan couldn't hold back any longer. He blurted out, "You can't treat us like this. We're people, not machines." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Bryce wheeled around, eyes blazing. "What did you just say?" Ethan's face was red, but he stood his ground. "You heard me. We've all had enough." Sophie looked at him in stunned admiration, while Lisa and Lucas exchanged tense glances. Bryce snarled, "Oh, you think you can speak for everyone now?" He stalked toward Ethan, shoulders squared. "Well, guess what? You're fired." A chill swept through the assembled employees. Bryce's hand shot out, pointing like an accusing finger at the trembling young man. "Clear out your desk, now." Ethan swallowed hard, tears threatening at the corners of his eyes, but he didn't back down. "Fine," he said, voice quavering. "If that's how you run things, I don't want to work here anyway." He turned to his co-workers, a spark of defiance in his gaze. "You all see this? This is what happens when you speak up. The crowd shuffled uneasily. Bryce smirked, as though enjoying his display of power. Then, as Ethan began to walk away, Bryce delivered a final humiliation. "Don't let the door hit you on your way out, boy." That was it. David Carter's patience evaporated. He felt something snap inside him. He couldn't stand by and watch this young man, this hard-working, earnest employee, be bullied out of a job he desperately needed. David tossed his mop aside, stepping forward with a calm but steely determination. Employees parted to let him through, confusion etched on their faces. Who was this janitor to intervene? Bryce turned, frowning as David approached. "You got something to say, janitor?" Bryce sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. David looked Bryce square in the eye. "Yes," he said, his voice calm but resonating with pent-up fury. "I've had enough." Silence descended. You could have heard a pin drop. Bryce blinked, then let out a short, mocking laugh. "Oh, really? And what are you going to do about it?" David said nothing for a moment, simply reached into his pocket and withdrew a sleek, leather-bound ID holder. Every eye in the office was on him as he flipped it open, revealing his photograph and an unmistakable title, Founder and CEO. A collective gasp echoed through the room. Bryce's smug grin melted into stunned horror. Employees stared, mouths agape. As the weight of the revelation settled in, the janitor was actually the head of the company. Bryce's face went deathly pale. His lips twitched as if trying to form words but failing. David let the silence stretch, allowing the magnitude of the moment to sink in. Finally he spoke, voice steady and cold. "You," he said, nodding toward Bryce, "are done here." A murmur of shock and awe rippled through the employees. David turned, sweeping his gaze over the crowd. Sophie's eyes were wide, tears still clinging to her lashes, but now they were tears of astonishment and relief. Ethan stood frozen, half-packed box in his arms, disbelief etched onto his features. Lisa and Lucas exchanged looks of profound vindication. The entire office seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Bryce opened his mouth, stammering excuses. I was just following orders from corporate. The numbers, the deadlines, it's all from the top." David stared at him, unimpressed. "I am the top," he said flatly. Then his voice rose, the anger he'd been suppressing finally bursting forth. "And I have never, not once, authorized treating employees like dirt." He turned to the assembled staff. "I've watched this man bully, harass, and demean you. He's created a culture of fear in a company that was supposed to be built on respect and innovation." Employees exchanged glances, some nodding vigorously. Bryce attempted to interrupt, but David silenced him with a glare. "Not another word," David hissed. "You've said plenty." The crowd parted as David walked closer to Bryce. "You're fired," David said, each syllable clipped and resounding. "Gather your things and leave this building immediately." Bryce's face contorted, disbelief wrestling with indignation. But, he spluttered, looking around for support. None came. The employees who'd once cowered before him now stood united, arms crossed, faces resolute. Sophie wiped her tears away, standing tall. Ethan set down his box, a flicker of hope lighting up his eyes. Bryce let out a bitter, disbelieving laugh. "You'll regret this," he spat. "You can't run this place without managers like me." David's expression hardened. "Watch me," he said simply. Then he motioned to a nearby security guard, who'd come out of the lobby once the commotion started. "Escort Mr. Walker out of the building," David commanded. The guard nodded, stepping forward. Bryce tried to maintain some shred of dignity, but it was a losing battle. As he was led away, he pointed a shaking finger at the employees. "You think this changes anything? You're all just pawns in a bigger machine." His voice faded as he disappeared around the corner, footsteps echoing in the stunned silence. For a moment, no one moved or spoke, as if they were collectively processing what had just occurred. Then Lisa let out a shaky laugh, tears in her eyes. Ethan exhaled a breath he seemed to have been holding for weeks. Sophie's shoulders sagged, relief flooding her face. David turned to them, heart pounding. He scanned the faces of the people who had suffered under Bryce's tyranny. "I'm sorry," he began quietly, voice carrying a sincere regret. "I'm sorry it took me so long to see what was happening here." A murmur rippled through the group. No one seemed to blame him. In fact, they looked grateful, as though they'd been pulled from a nightmare they thought would never end. David lifted a hand, gesturing for calm. "I promise things will change, effective immediately." The employees erupted in a spontaneous round of applause, a long-delayed release of tension and fear. Some clapped, some cheered, and a few even cried openly. David felt a lump in his throat, gratitude and sorrow tangling inside him. He walked over to Ethan, placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "I'm sorry you went through this," he said softly. "You still have a job here if you want it." Ethan nodded rapidly, tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. David turned to Sophie. "No more staying until midnight to appease a tyrant," he said, letting a gentler tone soften his words. Sophie smiled through her tears, nodding. Lisa and Lucas exchanged relieved glances, as though they'd witnessed a miracle. David straightened, addressing the group. "Go home for the day, all of you. Take some time to breathe. When you come back, we'll start fresh." A fresh wave of cheers followed. People quickly gathered their belongings, wearing expressions of cautious optimism. David watched them file out, group by group, hearts lighter than they'd been in a long while. He exhaled, a mix of emotional exhaustion and renewed hope washing over him. The chaos had subsided, but the real work of healing the company's culture had just begun. Still, this moment, this public, unequivocal stand, was exactly what was needed to cleanse the air of fear. Once the lobby was nearly empty, David spotted Sophie lingering by the reception desk. She approached him tentatively. "Thank you," she said softly, her eyes reflecting both gratitude and lingering disbelief. "I can't believe you're really the CEO." David gave a small smile, looking down at his worn janitor's uniform. "Undercover boss, I guess you could say." Sophie let out a half laugh, half sob. "Thank you." David nodded, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Go home, rest," he urged. She nodded, blinking back another wave of tears. Then she headed out, leaving David alone with his thoughts. As the building emptied, David found himself standing in the same lobby where he'd first arrived, in disguise, mop in hand. It felt like a lifetime ago, though it had only been a matter of days. He recalled the first snub from the receptionist, the manager berating Sophie, the hushed conversations about fear and desperation. Now, in the aftermath of Bryce's downfall, the atmosphere felt palpably different, lighter, almost cleansed. David ran a hand through his hair, stepping out of character at last. The uniform no longer felt oppressive. It felt like a reminder of what he'd done, the lengths he'd gone, in order to expose injustice. He walked to the big glass doors, gazing outside at the waning sunlight. He didn't know exactly how the corporate office would react to the news, but as CEO, he had the final say in such matters. Bryce was gone, his reign of terror finished. The employees were free from fear, and a chance for real healing and reform lay ahead. David let out a long breath, shoulders relaxing. He'd done what he set out to do, and it felt unbelievably satisfying. Yet he knew there was still work to be done, new management to be appointed, HR policies to be re-evaluated, and trust to be rebuilt. But for now, in this quiet moment, David allowed himself a small smile of triumph. He'd witnessed firsthand the bravery of people like Sophie and Ethan, even in the face of unrelenting cruelty. And he'd seen the entire staff, once paralyzed by fear, come together in a moment of shared relief the instant Bryce was removed. That was the true reward, the genuine payoff, a workplace freed from tyranny, an environment where people could once again hope and dream. As he turned off the lobby lights and locked the doors behind him, David couldn't help but reflect on everything that had transpired. It had been painful to watch his own company devolve into a pit of bullying and intimidation. But by going undercover, he'd cut out the cancer at its core. Tomorrow the building would open again under new management principles, ones guided by empathy, respect, and fairness. The storm had passed, leaving behind a clear path for reconstruction. David walked to his car, uniform rustling in the cool evening air. He paused, taking one last look at the building, a sense of finality washing over him. He knew the story here wasn't over, but this chapter, the chapter dominated by Bryce Walker's cruelty, was closed for good. And as the CEO turned the key in the ignition, he felt an unshakable certainty that the next chapter, for both him and his employees, would be better, kinder, and far more just than the one they left behind.